Good day, my friends. Good day. My name is Bob Bettler. I'm a jury consultant with DecisionQuest, and I've been doing this line of work for a little under 30 years in social science generally, and a little over 20 years in this particular brand of social scientific research. What I'm going to talk to you about today is, broadly speaking, juror attitudes and how they might have been affected by this pandemic. But it seems pretty clear to me, and maybe to you too, that the American jury system might be changing. I mean, 10 years ago, who ever heard of a Zoom trial? I was talking to a guy yesterday and he said, I can't come to your seminar, Bob. I'm in a Zoom trial. So the American jury system might be changing, but is the psychology of the American juror changing? That's one of the things I'm going to be looking at today. And to look at that, you have to have an historical perspective. Now, I'm uniquely situated at DecisionQuest. DecisionQuest is uniquely situated in the world in that we possess more data on jury decision making than anyone in the world. There is no academic. I'm extremely familiar with the academic research. There are, volumes and volumes and thousands of peer-reviewed papers written on jury decision making. I'm very familiar with this literature. I know what's out there in the other trial consulting companies. Nobody has the data that we have. So I'm going to be taking this historical perspective, seeing how maybe attitudes have changed in the COVID era. And, I can look back 20 years to detect those changes. Among the things I'll be talking about today, if I can get this to advance, is the psychological impact of the psychological impact of the pandemic over the course of 2020. And I can estimate how this pandemic, the reactions to the pandemic might have impacted verdict probabilities. This is something I can do with a historical perspective. I do that by looking at general pro-plaintiff and pro-defense propensities, especially in the realm of jury profiling, but it can also be extended and to talk about how in a specific case, the data might help decide the most effective case theme along with juror profiling and so on. So, what I'm going to be talking about first are a series of studies that we conducted last year, beginning in March and then continuing in May and October, to try to gauge the impact of the pandemic on jury decision making. Now, this fits in a kind of a long history of DecisionQuest researching past crises, like after Enron, after 9/11. After the Great Recession, in all of those instances and a few others, we conducted some focused research to see, well, is this historical event, is this social crisis impacting how jurors might decide one of your cases? This particular instance, now the data that I possess, I should describe it very briefly, but many of you might be familiar with it. The data that we possess comes from mock trials, comes from surveys, especially large-scale telephone and internet-based surveys, focus groups. There's a lot of qualitative data that comes out of a focus group, and then also more qualitative data and some quantitative data out of post-trial juror interviews. So we call the jurors up after your trial and ask them questions about what impacted their decision. In this particular instance, with the pandemic survey, we used our Case Explorer, which is an internet-based tool that allows us to administer a questionnaire to a large number of people. In this particular instance, for example, the aggregated sample consists of 2,785 people in various metropolitan areas like Los Angeles, New York. You see them on your screen there. The ones that I've underlined, we've assessed. We've conducted the survey in those particular cities multiple times. Some cities like Charlotte, so far we've only done once. We'll probably do them again at some point in the future. The questionnaire itself that's administered each time is largely the same, so we can get that historical perspective. We can get the kind of the carryover from month to month. But in each wave, we did introduce some new items. For example, the March survey ended on the day that George Floyd died in Minneapolis. And so in the May, we included a few questions about that. Now, I'm going to start with the pandemic and reactions to the pandemic. And as is the custom in psychology, we kind of parse the issue, parse the question into the ABCs. The impact on affect, that is emotion, the impact on behavior, and the impact on cognition, or how people think and perceive the world. I'll talk about the behavioral changes first. So one of the questions that we've asked in the survey in March, May, and October was, how much, if at all, has the virus disrupted your life? What this graph shows is a higher number means more disruption, a lower number means less disruption. So you can see in this graph here that what you might call the average life disruption is trending rather steadily downwards. This is the average for all the 2,785 folks. So disruption of life, the average life disruption is definitely trending downwards. But as we'll see with this particular question, life disruption, and with some others that I'll be talking about in a minute, it's not uniform across the demographics. What you see here is a division by gender, and you can see the red line as the average life disruption of the women in our study, and you can see it goes steadily down, 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 down. Whereas for the men in our study, the average life disruption went down until May and then started to level off. And there's actually an interesting crossover here. So women started off with a greater life disruption, but by October had less life disruption. Another way to gauge behavioral changes is in this question here. What describes your life these days? A low number means I'm staying home, I'm not going out. A high number means I'm living more normally. I'm trending toward normalcy. And that's what you see in this graph here is between March and May, only a slight trend toward normalcy, but then a greater trend towards normalcy between May and October. And here too, we do see some demographic differences. Although I tell you in general, some demographic differences are non-existent. For example, there are very, very few differences, and in all of these things I'm talking about today, very few differences across cities. So to a large extent, New York, Chicago, Miami, Los Angeles, people are kind of reacting pretty similarly. But anyway, in this one here, people, especially in the May to October timeframe, are noticeably, significantly trending toward normality. Again, though, this is not totally uniform across demographics. For example, here you see baby boomers with the blue line on the bottom. They're tending more to stay at home. Baby boomers, by the way, is my generation, my cohort. Whereas the younger cohorts, everybody is trending up. Everybody is trending toward a more normal life. But the baby boomers like me, we're kind of lagging. By the way, on all of these, there's an accompanying article that's posted up with this webinar, and you can download that article. It gives several more details, especially on the pandemic reactions. So behaviorally, what we see is sort of inching toward back, I hope to say, toward a normal life. All right, behavior. Now let's talk about cognition. Cognition has to do with how people perceive the world and then how they think about the world. Sort of artificially sets aside emotion, artificially sets aside behavior. They're actually all connected. Affect, behavior, cognition are all connected. But we're going to kind of just look at each one separately. What's really important in cognition is perception, because how we think about the world is very strongly impacted by our perceptions of the world. We gauged perceptions in one way with this question here. Do you think that out there, the news, the information about the coronavirus is generally exaggerated? That's higher on this scale would be people who said, oh, it's exaggerated. Generally correct, that's kind of in the middle. And then a lower number means that the coronavirus pandemic is the seriousness and so on is generally underestimated. And what you see on average with our 2,785 respondents is people are hugging pretty close to the correct, generally correct point on the scale. So people's perceptions, though, again, impact how we view the world. And when I dug into different subgroups in our sample, I found that there are some pretty significant differences depending on your the respondents' political framework, their political views. For example, oopsie, went too far. The red line is the Republican, the self-identified Republicans in our survey. The gray line is the self-identified independents, and the blue line would be the self-identified Democrats. And what you see here is that the red line, the Republicans, significantly more likely to think that the seriousness of the coronavirus is generally exaggerated. Republicans think it's exaggerated. The blue line shows that the Democrats lean toward thinking that it's underestimated, and the independents, as is often the case, they hug pretty close to the generally correct line on the point on the scale. What you also see in this graph is that between May and October, in the run-up to, let's see, there was something important that happened last year in November. It was the election. In the run-up to the election, the Republicans they sort of accelerated in the direction of saying that the coronavirus is exaggerated. So, other demographic groups, you can look in my article, there might be a few little changes, but for the most part, other demographic groups and so on viewed it pretty much the same. It was just this Republican subsample who viewed the seriousness differently. All right, so talked about behavior, talked about cognition and perception. Now let's talk about people's affective, their emotional reactions. In this realm, we're talking about fear, for example. How concerned are you that you or somebody you know will be infected with the virus? A higher number means more concerned. A A lower number means less concerned. And you can see here in this graph a very slight trend toward or away from being very concerned, but people are still pretty concerned that they or somebody they know will be infected. And it's relatively stable, but trending very, very slightly downwards, which is to be expected, I guess. But again, there are a few demographic differences, not a lot, and you'll see in the article, if you check that out, that there aren't a million, there aren't a ton of demographic differences. But in this realm here, there is one area where there's a few differences, namely with respect to the cohorts, the generations. Now here, let me remind you that baby boomers, my generation, go from about 46 to the mid 60s. Gen X comes after that. They go up until, I don't have it in front of me. All of this, by the way, is based on some pretty standard definitions. And then you've got your millennials in the gray line and your Gen Z, the newest, the youngest cohort. And you can see here that the Gen Z, the youngest, are the least concerned. Gen X is actually fairly concerned that they or somebody they know might get the virus. Interestingly, the baby boomers show sort of a steady trend toward less concern, the blue line, less and less and less. Otherwise, especially with the affective reaction to the coronavirus, there are very few differences across demographics. If you look in the article, I'll give you some more detail on this. And in general, there are fewer differences here in the affective realm. So the lesson I drew from that is that we might react, different people might react behaviorally differently. They might see the pandemic differently. But in large measure, we are all sort of reacting emotionally. We're impacted emotionally very similarly. Now, to really gauge how the pandemic might be impacting us, you must take a historical perspective. And I'm in, as I said before, kind of a unique position in that I have data that's unmatched anywhere, to my knowledge, anywhere in the world, not in academia, not in trial consulting, because we've been doing this for over 20 years and accumulating the data. So that allows me to take a historical perspective that maybe other folks really can't take, at least not in a way that's backed up by data. Nobody has the data that DecisionQuest has. So to discuss this historical perspective, I need to lay a little foundation. One of the things that goes along with the research I've done and that I've seen is that a person's life experiences sort of predispose him or her to certain attitudes. The attitudes that the juror brings into the courtroom will impact his or her reactions to the evidence, and that in turn impacts their verdict propensities. So life experiences to attitudes, to evidence, to verdicts. Now this happens, what happens as far as attitudes and verdicts, the research strongly suggests something called the liberation hypothesis. This was first proposed back in the 60s by some researchers out of Chicago called Calvin and Zeisel. Very, very famous researchers. I got the book right over here. The liberation hypothesis says that in a trial, in a jury trial, it is the strength of the evidence that determines the outcome of the trial. Okay, well, that's good. The evidence should. But in a situation where the strength of evidence for both sides is roughly balanced, which is the situation in every trial that actually makes it to a jury, if the strength of evidence is balanced, jurors' prior attitudes are liberated to exert more of an impact. And this happens in accordance with what's called confirmation bias, which I think a lot of people know about already. The confirmation bias says that I will accept ideas that confirm or are consistent with my prior beliefs, and I will reject your arguments and your evidence or your persuasive message if it is inconsistent. So I'm more likely to accept evidence, more likely to accept your arguments and so on if it's consistent with my prior beliefs. I'll maybe talk about this other stuff in a minute. But I want to talk about two attitude domains that the research, both our proprietary research and the academic research, have long pointed to as being correlated, attitudes that are correlated with verdicts. One realm is attitudes about big corporations, and another is attitudes about litigation, attitudes about civil litigation. Let me take attitudes about big corporations first. Attitudes about big corporations fall on what I call the Michael Moore Dick Cheney scale. So on the Michael Moore end, you have people who think, and there's a bunch of them out there, people who think that big corporations are, the root of all of society's ills. On the other hand, you have Dick Cheney kind of juror. Dick Cheney, actually, I had a juror one time. I was doing a jury selection in Wilmington, Delaware, and a question about corporations was asked, and this juror said, quote, "Big corporations are the backbone of the economy." So that Dick Cheney type of juror was immediately stricken by the plaintiffs. And then I see all the time, I see Michael Moore type of jurors, and they sometimes bring this hostility towards corporations into cases where it's really not appropriate. For example, I worked a case in New Hampshire one time where the defendant was not a big corporation. The defendant was just like a little mom and pop company, but this plaintiff had been hurt, and yet there were people in that mock trial who kind of went total Michael Moore on this little mom and pop company. So of course the plaintiff would like to have a jury full of Michael Moores, and the defendant would like to have a jury just chock full of Dick Cheneys. When I aggregate attitudes about big corporations over the entire 20-something year span of data that I possess, it breaks out like this. Most people, the plurality, 48% of people, are somewhat favorable toward large corporations. You see on the left, a small number, it's slightly less than 10%, are very unfavorable. These are your hardcore Michael Moore jurors. On the far right, 12% or so are very favorable. These are your Dick Cheney jurors, right? But most people are kind of in the middle. Now, because I have data spanning 20 years or so, I can look back at history and see over histories and between about 2001 to present, what are how are people's average attitudes changing? And what you see is in the up to about 2008 or so, attitudes were trending toward favorable. People were trending toward favorable attitudes. Then after 2008, attitudes toward big corporations started trending downward and downward and downward. Kind of reached a low point in the 2016 timeframe, and have sort of bounced back a tiny bit. This downward trend, though, could easily be attributable. I have some supplemental research that says it just might be easily attributable to the Great Recession. and the feelings about corporations after the Great Recession, the buyouts, and so on. So attitudes toward big corporations over time have trended in the unfavorable direction, and maybe possibly rebounding now, very slightly. General opinion of most large corporations. Another domain that of attitudes that could impact jury decision making is attitudes about civil litigation. It's kind of an interesting thing that, 15 or 20 years ago, when I would go and help out in a jury selection, every time in a jury selection, somebody, the jurors, juror, attorney, somebody would talk about McDonald's hot coffee. Oh, McDonald's hot coffee. It's terrible, terrible, terrible. And so people thought, oh, damages, the juries are out of control. I don't hear much about McDonald's hot coffee in the last couple of years. So that's attitudes about civil litigation might be changing. And indeed, the evidence is that they kind of are. Here's a graph that shows a trend from people saying damages in lawsuits are too high, up at the high end of the scale. The middle is about right, and the low end of the scale is people who say damages are too low. And here you got a trend away from people saying that damages are too high. The trend in the direction of getting close to the about right. Damages awarded in lawsuits are about right. A trend, you see a marked trend toward that about right, which could perhaps indicate some greater satisfaction with the civil justice system. Fewer people who believe that damages and juries are out of control. Here, as in other instances, there are a few demographic differences. Now, the blue line at the top, this is the silent generation, and after 2013-16 timeframe, they sadly dropped out of our surveys. But then Generation Z, this single dot over here, they appeared. But in general, you can see that baby boomers, the red line, are leaning a little bit still toward too high, and the younger generations, millennials and Gen Z, are leaning toward believing that damages are about right. In other words, juries are not crazy, out of control, and so on. Now, what I want to talk about then is how do we assess this historically and so on? Well, what I've done is I've taken the data from the three-part pandemic survey, and I have, in each of these surveys, in each of these three surveys, each of them presented 3 case summaries and asked the respondents to react. Which way would you lean? In a case like this, would you lean toward the plaintiff? Would you lean toward the defendant? And what I did was I aggregated this to give kind of a generalized, again, we're talking 30,000 feet. I'm not talking specific cases, specific venues, but just this generalized plaintiff or defense tendency. I will say on a personal note that there is such a thing as a generalized pro-plaintiff tendency. There is such a thing as a generalized pro-defense tendency. Now, it can be weak, it can be irrelevant in some cases, but it's out there. I have seen it in hundreds and hundreds of real jurors, not to mention mock jurors. So anyway, I aggregate this, and what you get is an average plaintiff win rate of right at 51%, which that's about right. That makes some sense. And then I can look at what factors, what demographic, what attitudinal factors increased the probability of a plaintiff win, what factors, what juror characteristics, in other words, decreased the probability of a plaintiff win. Now, here we're getting into something very strange. In the pandemic surveys last year, with the 2,785 folks, we asked them the same question we've been asking for over 20 years. What's your general opinion of large corporations? And then I crossed that. I looked at how that was correlated with the probability of a plaintiff verdict. So here you see the people who are very unfavorable toward large corporations found for the plaintiff at the rate of 59%. People who were somewhat unfavorable, about 50-50, somewhat favorable, had a lower pro-plaintiff verdict propensity, lower probability. But now here's something very odd. The people who were most favorable toward large corporations, you would think that those Dick Cheneys who were most favorable toward large corporations would be in favor of the defendant. But in this 2020 sample, it goes the other way. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a historical change. If I did this same analysis, I have more times than I can count, if I did this same analysis back in 2005, 6, 7, something like that, you would see a straight linear trend. So the highest plaintiff probability would be the unfavorable, next is somewhat unfavorable, and you would see that the people who are very favorable to corporations would have the lowest pro-plaintiff verdict probability. This is a historical change. I'm going to get into a little bit what's behind that historical change. Before I do that, though, I am going to return to the other attitude domain. Damages in lawsuits. Are they too low? Are they about right? Are they too high? Again, this is the breakout of the pandemic survey last year, the 2,785. Again, as I've seen in past years, it's about right. Most of the plurality says about right. I think I showed something like this before. But when you look at that with respect to verdict probability, you see the expected trend. So the people who say damages are too low, fine for the plaintiff at the rate of 58%. The people who say damages in lawsuits are about right, fine for the plaintiff, basically 50-50. And as you would expect, the people who say that damages are too high, they tend to lean a little bit toward the defendant. This is the trend you would expect. This historically has been what we've seen in 15 or 20 years ago. Now, so attitudes about big corporations in 2020 are behaving differently. Attitudes about civil litigation, pretty much the same as 15, 20 years ago, same as in past history. But what we looked at, especially in this round of surveys, is how does concern, how does your affective reaction to the coronavirus impact verdict probabilities? And what this graph shows is across the 9 cases that were presented to this 2,780 folks, again, 3 at a time, and 900 or so saw 3 cases, another 900 or so saw different 3 cases. There was some carryover, but you see a pretty consistent trend here that on the right, the dark blue and whatever that color is, dark respondents, the people who said they were very concerned, the people who said they were more concerned, in every instance found for the plaintiff at a higher rate. See that in all 9 of these case scenarios. people who are more concerned about the coronavirus, about they or their loved ones getting the coronavirus, they tend to find for the plaintiff at a higher rate. Now, when I collapse this into one graph, again, I see it again. The people who are most concerned about getting the coronavirus find for the plaintiff at the rate of 60%. The others are below 50%. Again, the baseline was 51%. This has some implications. It sort of suggests that right now is not a bad time for a civil defendant to have a jury trial, because these people who are very concerned, they are more pro-plaintiff, and they could be more likely to get out, to be excused from jury duty. So there's some suggestion here, there's an indication that maybe this is not a horrendously bad time. Maybe this is a little bit more favorable time for a defendant than, say, a year or two ago. But here too, there are some interesting exceptions, some wrinkles to this. In order to talk about it, I need to talk a little bit about regression analyses, multiple regression. When you do a regression, you can have a single predictor called a bivariate. You have two variables. You have the predictor, like some attitude, and the thing that's predicted, the verdict probability, bivariate. What you see in a multivariate regression, where you don't just have one predictor, you have 2, 3, 4. I actually had, I don't know, a dozen or so different predictors. What you see is that some things drop out of the equation. For example, attitudes about big corporations in the recent research don't really have as much of an impact when you take other factors into account. I'll give you kind of an illustration of this. So again, in these 9 surveys, the average, the sort of the baseline pro-plaintiff verdict was 51%. As I showed you before, if the folks in our 2020 surveys were strongly in favor of big corporations, paradoxically, they found for the plaintiff at even higher. But this is kind of a recent phenomenon, because if you go back in time, for example, if I look at baby boomers in this survey, in the 2023 waves of survey, baby boomers, they behave the way that traditionally jurors have behaved in our research. A baby boomer who is strongly in favor of big corporations, has a favorable view, they only find for the plaintiff at the rate of 33%. What's going on there is the younger generations grew up in a different environment. They don't have the same feelings about big corporations. The older folks, I include myself in that number, kind of followed the old pattern. All right. But as I think I mentioned a minute ago, if people are very concerned about COVID, they tend to find for a plaintiff at a higher percentage. If people strongly agree that most lawsuits are legitimate, it's a separate question that we asked in our survey, they also tend to find for a plaintiff at a high percentage. But again, in the multiple regression, the corporation attitude drops out of the equation. It's eclipsed by other things. For example, generational differences and concern. Right now, concern about getting the virus is kind of predictive. Another thing that is predictive is people who look favorably upon the social safety net, taking care of the poor and so on. Those people who favor a strong social safety net, as you might expect, tend to find for a plaintiff. And again, there's kind of a generational wrinkle here, is that Baby boomers who do not favor a strong social safety net, baby boomers who disfavor a strong social safety net, you can see they're finding for the plaintiff only at the rate of about 20%. So, in other words, 80% of them, baby boomers like me, who are against, social welfare and social safety net and so on. They're really pro-defense kind of jurors. So, kind of winding down here, I got a little bit of a summary that I want to talk to you about, and maybe we can take some questions. I try to set aside a few minutes for questions. So to summarize, and again, I will point you to the article that accompanies this. In the behavioral realm, the folks in the 2,780 folks in our survey, they are trending toward a more normal life. So some of the younger generations are kind of leading the way. We old-timers, the baby boomers, we're sort of lagging back a little bit, letting the young folks test it out first. But everybody is sort of going in the direction of a more normal life. In the cognitive realm, there are actually relatively few differences until you take into account a person's political point of view. And when you take that into account, there's just a tremendous difference, a very strong difference between your more conservative Republicans and so on, and the other folks in the survey, the Democrats and Independents. The Republicans think the whole thing is overblown. The Republicans in our survey, at least, and the Republicans in our survey, especially in the May to October realm, sort of accelerated in that belief. But in the affective realm, and again, I'll point you to the article, there's very few differences in how we are all reacting emotionally. So Republicans and Democrats are kind of, united in that respect in how they are emotionally reacting, their fear and so on. It is possible. There seems to be some pretty good evidence here that longer-term trends indicate a very interesting difference in how people view big corporations. So in the older generation, and when I did research like this 15 or 20 years ago, it's quite common to see that the Michael Moore kind of a anti-corporation juror would be a very good plaintiff juror, and the Dick Cheney juror would be a good defense juror. It's right now, it doesn't appear to be the case, but it has a lot to do with that attitude domain being eclipsed, at least right now. In the immediate impacts, if you will, on jury decision making. There's something going on with the COVID impact, the COVID reaction, and jury decision making. Control motivation. So a lot of what's going on in these results is control motivation. Like I said before, control motivation becomes especially sort of acute. It sort of grows in times of social upheaval, social tumult. I have an article, and I try to make this available to you too, that reviews the other research, these very solid peer-reviewed research on different economic crises and how this motivates people to try to get control. And then I have some research, it's published, I've got an article that I'd be happy to spread around that shows from our data how people who bore the brunt, who suffered the most during the 2008-2009 economic collapse, those folks tended to sort of swing toward the plaintiff. have another article that I wrote in the same time frame that shows how more of the psychological underpinnings, for example, a social crisis, and you can see this in floods and hurricanes and all sorts of crises, tends to pull people together. People start to get on the same side. There's a hint of that going on in the jury realm as well. Thank you all. Bye-bye.